like to encourage you this morning to think back to a memorable conversation that you have had. And it could be a conversation that happened very recently. It could have been a dialogue that you had with someone else a long time ago. I spent some time with some other ministers last week in Michigan in a class, and so I really did have some of those meaningful, if not thought-provoking dialogues last week. It was really good to just listen to other people and listen to what they're doing and even take in some of their insights as well. But when I think about memorable conversations, I also think in terms of life-changing interchanges with someone else. And for me, some of those life-changing dialogues took place a long time ago. In particular, I'm remembering a conversation that I had with my mother in 1979. She did most of the talking, and I did most of the listening. I had walked down to the payphone at Monterey High School. This is well before cell phones, as you can well imagine. Had to use a quarter to call home. I had gotten in a little trouble at school. I was a senior in high school. No, that's really not accurate. I had gotten in a lot of trouble at school. So I called home, and it was a moment of confession. And she told me that I would not drive my car again until I was 25 years old when we had that dialogue. But now, in retrospect, and looking all these years later, 1979, I actually flushed a full debate scholarship to Texas Tech as a result of my actions. And as I think about the punishment, I think about how life-changing that set of circumstances was at the time. It really determined the whole course of my life in a positive way. There's no doubt I would have gone on to Tech. I think I would have gotten my degree in communications, and I was fully on track to go to law school at Tech. Well, no, there's not a thing going wrong with going to law school, but I'm so thankful that I've had the blessing to do what I've done now for almost 36 years. And those wheels, in a sense, were set in motion by a meaningful dialogue that happened in the fall of 1979. One of the characteristics of John's gospel is there are several memorable and life-changing dialogues. There's one in John chapter 3 where Jesus has this conversation with a Pharisee, a member of the Jewish ruling council by the name of Nicodemus. And Mark did a really good job of delving into that dialogue in John 3 last Sunday. Today, Jesus is going to meet a woman from Samaria. It's recorded in John chapter 4. And it's most definitely going to be placed in the category of a meaningful and, yes, life-changing conversation, not only for this woman from a village in Samaria, but also other people that she knew, that she lived with in that same general area. I want to do something unique today, and I probably asked you to do this before. I want you to imagine that you have never read this story from John chapter 4 before. And that may be true for some of you. Some of you have never heard this interchange that Jesus has with this woman from Samaria in John 4. And if that's the case, that's not a problem in the least. But some of you have read that passage numerous times. You've been in Bible classes where the text has been discussed. You've heard sermons on John 4. So I just want to encourage you to erase as much of that as you possibly can. And as I read John 4, 1 through 26 this morning, hear it as if you have heard it for the first time. Fred Craddock wrote a number of books on preaching. He was an expert on preaching. He's deceased now. He even wrote a book entitled Preaching. And in the book Preaching, Craddock says this about this naive reading of Scripture. He says, this reading is a spontaneous, even naive engagement with the text. All faculties of mind and heart are open with no concern with what one ought to think. This is the time to listen, think, feel, imagine, and ask. A naive hearing of the passage as if you have never heard it before. Let's read John 4, 1 through 26. It's a fairly lengthy reading, but I don't think it's one of those passages where we want to leave anything out. And so the time just to listen. Imagine you're there. Imagine you're standing close by this well, and you're actually overhearing what Jesus says, and in turn overhearing what this unnamed woman from Samaria says in return. John 4, 1 through 26. The Pharisees heard that Jesus was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not John who baptized, but his disciples. When the Lord learned of this, he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now, he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about the 6th hour. In other words, it was about noontime of day. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You're a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as also did his sons and his flocks and herds?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." He told her, "Go call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said to her, "You're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you're a prophet. Our forefathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." Jesus declared, "Believe me, woman, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth." The woman said, "I know that Messiah called Christ is coming, and when he comes, he'll explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, "I who speak to you am he." Can you imagine? And remember, you're over here to the side of the well, and you have the opportunity to overhear this conversation that takes place. And as she makes reference to the long-awaited Messiah, the anointed one, the Christ, he makes it ever so clear to her, "Oh, by the way, you are actually talking to him at this very moment." So why? why is this particular story included in John's gospel? And I think that's a legitimate question to ask of any passage. Well, obviously God intended one particular story or one particular event to be included in the gospel, so it's legitimate to ask why. And I think frequently we conclude, well, that's so the readers, that's us, so that we can focus on the life experiences of this unnamed woman from Samaria. Do you think that's true? Well, perhaps it is true, because isn't that where we generally place our energies? We think about this woman, and we actually make lots of assumptions about her. We think, ooh, her past appears a little sketchy. She's had 5 husbands, and she's with some guy that's not her husband now. And we make lots of assumptions. We assume that something very inappropriate and immoral has gone on because she's had 5 husbands, when it could be that those 5 husbands died. We don't know. And we don't know much about the fact that she's with somebody who's not her husband. We don't know a lot of things, but we tend to jump right in and focus on her character. So is that a reason for it's included? Perhaps it is one reason. The story enhances our understanding of worship because we tend to take that one verse in John 4:23, the true worshipers worship in spirit and in truth, and we camp out there and lift that out of its context and say this passage is all about worship. Well, again, legitimate passage, obviously an important truth, but it's equally important to focus on that truth in its proper context in this narrative, in this interchange that Jesus has with a woman from Samaria. I would argue this interchange enhances our understanding of Jesus. This helps us to understand who he really is, inasmuch as it helped this woman from Samaria have a better, if not more complete, understanding of his identity. We should say with a resounding exclamation point, Jesus is the focus of this story. Jesus is the complete focus of this story, that we might believe in him. So why is it included? Back to the passage that Stan shared with us a moment ago. John 20:30 and 31. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And that's why this interchange with the woman from Samaria is included, that you may believe, that you may have a better understanding of his true identity and believe in him. So if that's true, then what does an interchange with a woman from Samaria reveal about Jesus? And I think there were some things that revealed about Jesus' character in his dialogue with Nicodemus, and I believe that it's going to be true in regard to his opportunity to speak with this woman from Samaria. I believe the first one is just the reality of his humanity. Second half of verse 6, Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was the 6th hour. It was about noon. And John includes this detail that he was tired and he was thirsty. Now, there is no doubt that in the Gospel of John, John stresses the deity of Jesus more than any of the other Gospel writers. Think of John's prologue in the very first 3 verses of John 1. The Word was with God, and the Word was God, the deity of Christ. But John also stresses and underscores the reality of Jesus' humanity. He was a real man. He felt thirst. He felt fatigue, just as any of us would as well. And just out of curiosity this morning, it's one of those challenge questions as you go home this afternoon and start thinking about your own priorities and the own opportunities that present themselves for you to speak to someone about Jesus. If you're weary, tired and cranky is sometimes the phrase I use in my home. Sometimes when I come home, I just say, let me alone for a few minutes. I'm tired and cranky. So those moments when you are tired and cranky, are you inclined to initiate not just a conversation, but are you inclined to initiate a meaningful conversation with a total and complete stranger. Secondly, it's obvious. Jesus displays his genuine compassion and love for this woman from Samaria, of all places. Verses 7 and 8. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" And his disciples gone into town to buy food. H-E-B was open that day. And they had gone in to buy food in Samaria while he's in this little small village. And there's a phrase I'm using here, and I think it's an important phrase. Jesus initiates what I'm going to refer to as a redemptive conversation. That's an important phrase. Are you willing to have a thoughtful, spiritually focused conversation with someone, especially someone who may not have a lot of background in church? They may not be a Christian at all. Are you willing to have a conversation that's very spiritually focused? It's a redemptive conversation. I just have to pause for a moment and be reflective. I recall in my early years as a Christian hearing guest speakers who would come in and talk about evangelism and talk about teaching people the gospel, and they would use phrases that, well, to be truthful, it sounded to me more like they were encouraging us to be used car salesmen more than they were encouraging us to be reaching out to people with the gospel. And I even recall phrases such as "close the deal." Now, as a new Christian and as young as I most definitely was not the brightest bulb on the strand by any stretch of the imagination. But I found such references and such language to be troubling because I thought, that's not me. I'm not a used car salesman, and in terms of teaching someone the gospel or sharing some aspect of my spiritual journey, closing the deal did not resonate and continues not to resonate with me at all today. But the phrase redemptive conversation, a conversation that's thoughtful and meaningful and focused on Jesus, to look at Jesus as an example in the way he has this conversation with this woman from Samaria, that feels natural. I think of the term organic. It feels natural. It feels organic. It feels like it flows in a way that God is using us as his instrument to touch somebody else's heart. That's what resonates with me, a redemptive conversation. So I would challenge you this morning. Are you open? Are you willing to take advantage of opportunities that are just, here they come out of the blue, sometimes very unexpected, in the most routine of events, such as drawing water from a well? And that, in their world, that was a very routine, normal daily activity, and a redemptive conversation came as a consequence. And perhaps most importantly, as we think about the genuine compassion of Jesus and how he viewed this woman, Jesus viewed her as a beloved soul. And I'm wondering if everyone that you meet, everyone that you have opportunity to interact with, do you view those individuals as a beloved soul, someone created in the very image of God? I use some language in this next point very purposely. Jesus chose to plow over barriers so that this redemptive conversation could occur. And I believe the phrase plow over is very fitting and appropriate because that's what he did. There were some social, there were some religious barriers that he didn't walk over them. I mean, he plowed over them very forcefully by the choices that he made. So as you can tell, she's a little surprised. In verse 9, the Samaritan woman said to him, "You're a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" And for Jews to not associate with Samaritans. And I have to tell you this morning, that last phrase is understatement. They didn't associate at all. There was no socializing. It was complete, total, absolute segregation. So Jesus plowed over these barriers, and I want to share this thought that comes from a commentator who wrote a book on the Gospel of John. Here's what he says. Jesus and the nameless Samaritan woman were from two different and historically adversarial people, each of whom considered the other to have deviated drastically from the ancient faith of Israel. Both Israelite groups considered the other to be imposters. Now, there's a lot of historical information regarding the Samaritans that would probably be of great interest to you and would be very fitting to discuss in a Bible class setting. But for our purposes this morning, so that we can have an enhanced understanding of what's going on here in John 4, this is what's really important. There was most definitely this adversarial relationship, and they most definitely thought on each side that they were right. The Samaritans thought they were right, and the Jews thought they were right, and so you have this clash that's been going on for a long, long time. For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. So Jesus did not allow such prevailing animosity to hinder him at all. He plowed over the natural barrier that existed between Samaritans and Jews. The second thing is, she was a woman, and a rabbi would not greet a woman in public. In their culture, that was socially unacceptable. I thought y'all would appreciate this. There was a group known as the Bruised and Bleeding Pharisees. Ever heard of them? They were a real thing. They were called the Bruised and Bleeding Pharisees because they shut their eyes when they saw a woman, and as a result, walked into walls and houses. So I thought I could not let today go by and not let y'all hear about the bruised and bleeding Pharisees. That's how strict, that's how seriously they took not having any sort of social engagement, especially between a rabbi and a woman. So the Samaritan woman, she's probably surprised on two levels. She's surprised because of the barrier between Samaritans and Jews, and furthermore, she's surprised, here's a man who's obviously Jewish, and he is speaking to me in public. I don't think that creative is the best word. I may need to use the thesaurus in a better way, but creative is what I came up with. Jesus taught this woman in a creative way that led her to a place of belief. So in verse 10, he answered her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asked you for a drink, you'd have asked him, he would have given you living water. So it's obvious that both the conversation that Jesus had with Nicodemus in John chapter 3 and this conversation with the woman from Samaria model some very innovative teaching methods. Jesus, if you note his teaching methods, of course, the parables are employed extensively in the Synoptic Gospels, and he does some really out-of-the-box things in terms of the way he approaches people and how he engages in what I, again, would refer to as a redemptive dialogue. And so consequently, he is able to reveal his identity in a miraculous manner. She says, give me this water so I have to keep getting thirsty. And this is when he reveals to her information about her life that he could not have possibly known. And I do believe the reason for this is not to focus on her character, not to note that she has some kind of sketchy past, but instead the focus is to demonstrate he had miraculous knowledge. The focus is on him. The focus is on Jesus. So he reveals his identity in a miraculous manner, but where do we typically go? I mentioned this a moment ago. Where do we typically go? We go with, oh, the Samaritan woman. We get all caught up with who she was, and we lose sight of what's really going on. I don't think we can leave here this morning without thinking about Colossians 4, 5, and 6. And I believe the most natural and appropriate invitation following this interchange in John 4 is to ask ourselves, are you open and are you alert? Open to people, all kinds of people. Do you have a basic willingness in your heart to plow over any social, religious, or cultural barrier that would exist between you and someone who could be on the receiving end and benefit from a redemptive conversation. So the Apostle Paul says in Colossians 4, 5 and 6, be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation always be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. And I fully acknowledge there's probably barriers that hold you back, and I don't want to plow over because there's this fear of turning people off. And I think furthermore, there are people who are invisible. People who go unnoticed. People who are socially invisible to us. I'm asking myself that question this week. That's the question I'm posing to myself. Who has always been invisible to me that I need to take note of? In the age of technology, we think about everybody's got their nose stuck in a phone. I had a layover coming back from Detroit and Baltimore last Sunday night. And I was just looking at the gate as we're waiting for our plane to come. Everybody had their nose stuck in a phone. And interestingly enough, there was a guy sitting next to me. I thought he was an older guy. I thought he was an old guy sitting next to me. And he strikes up a conversation with me, and I asked him where he's from. He said, I'm from Milwaukee. I said, oh, you are? I said, I grew up in Racine. And as we started talking, he had competed in cross-country track and wrestling with my friends who also grew up in Racine. And then it hit me. I just thought of him as an old guy. This guy's my age. And I thought, I don't look that old. He looks older. It may not be true. Reality is your friend, you know. Denial is not a river in Egypt, but we had a really meaningful interchange and got our nose out of a phone. And you have to ask yourself, what social barriers exist? The most important invitation I could offer this morning is, at the end of the day, do you love people like Jesus does? All people. All people from all walks of life. I'm going to ask our elders, our shepherds that shepherd the congregation here, would y'all stand where you are? Would appreciate it. Stan's going to lead us in an invitation song. These are fine men. And if there's a way they could pray over you, and I had a good conversation with one of the elders before Bible class this morning. He said, it doesn't have to be some concern. It could be something you're thankful for. You just want to share and express it. They would be willing to pray for you, encourage you, and have a very meaningful, if not redemptive, conversation with you. Let's stand and sing this morning.